we begin our painting today, I'd like to start with a mantra to center all of us in a positive mindset to set the tone and energy of this painting. Now, painting can be a very vulnerable activity, and we're often our own top critics. So let's make a pact right now to appreciate every paint stroke we paint and being grateful for being present in this very moment and letting your creative spirit do its thing and being free of judgment and critique. Your art will be beautiful because you created it. So the first step of our cherry blossom tree painting is painting in our background. So the design of our background is going to be dark gray at the top, then medium gray, light gray in the middle, back to darker gray at the bottom. So everyone's going to need a little bit of titanium white on their paint palette. I'm just going to squeeze out some titanium white. And they'll need also a little bit of black. So you don't need quite as much black. You need a little bit more of that white compared to the black because black is a very strong pigment and a little goes a long way. Next, you're going to pick up your large flat brush, and you're going to moisten it a bit in water, the bristles in water, and then you're going to wipe off the excess on the sides. So we don't want our paintbrush soaking wet, we just want it nice and moist. And then we're going to pick up some black with our paintbrush, and we're going to add small little dollops of black to the top of our canvas, and we're going to do the same to the bottom of our canvas. So we don't need very much, just 3 or 4 dots at the bottom and 3 at the top is great. And then you're going to scoop up. You don't have to wash off your brush. You can just scoop up right away some white, and we want lots of white on this canvas. So we're going to put that white all over in bigger dollops. And then once this is blended, it's going to give a nice gray color. Okay, so once you've added enough white to your canvas, you definitely want more white than that black. You're going to take your paintbrush without cleaning it off, and we're going to use back and forth strokes to blend that paint. And using these back and forth strokes is what's going to blend out this paint and give those even smooth background. So now you want to work your way down the canvas until the entire canvas is covered with those back and forth strokes. And if you find your paint is a little bit scratchy, you can go back up and cover those areas. And also, if you find that you don't have enough of that paint on your canvas, you can go ahead and add more dollops of it. And also sometimes too, when you're working with like a thicker, heavy-bodied paint, like the ones in the tubes, you need to add a little bit more water to your brush to make them a little bit more fluid. So you can go ahead and pick up a tiny amount of water on your brush and use that to make the paint glide even easier, almost like butter. So you're going to work your way down to the bottom, and then blend out that black at the bottom too. So those back and forth strokes are really important here because that's what's going to help get that paint blended on our canvas. So another tip in blending paint on your canvas is we want to avoid having blocks of color. So here we don't want it to go from like a dark gray right to a white or a light gray. You want to have like more of a gradient. So what you can do is actually you work that line. So when there's a line like that, distinct line like that, you go over it while your paint is still wet, and you keep on working that paint with those back and forth strokes. And that's what's going to give a more even gradient. So now you can see it's already going from a dark gray to like a medium gray to a lighter gray. So that's a nice little tip to make your backgrounds have a more gentle gradient. And then you can just keep on smoothing out those brush strokes. So here you can see my brush strokes very clearly. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to go over them with these horizontal strokes with my brush to smooth them out. And again, at the bottom, I want to avoid those blocks of colors. So I'm going to work that line between that dark gray and that light gray just to smooth it out and make a really graduated gradient instead of blocks of color that are a little harsher. And as long as the paint is still wet, you can continue working it. So if you have any brush strokes that are bothering you that are in the painting, you can continue going over it with these horizontal strokes. We also want to make sure that the gray in the middle is not too dark, because we're going to be painting the tree trunk later. We want that to have a nice contrast between the background. So if it's a little bit too dark here, you can go ahead and I'm going to show you. I'm going to add a little bit more white to my palette, and I can just add a little bit of white right on it and just blend and just lighten it out even more. So you can always fix it if it's a little bit too dark, because the black is very strong and it can quickly overpower the whole painting. So to lighten it back up, just add small dollops of that white back into your painting and just keep on blending it out with those horizontal strokes. Now, once you've covered your entire canvas and you're happy with your background, we're going to leave this to dry about 5 to 7 minutes. Now, if your background is taking a little bit longer to dry, you can go ahead and use a hairdryer in this step. Maybe everyone pass around a hairdryer for the background to dry faster. And to know when your painting is dried, your background is dried, you just take your finger and tap on it and see it's a little bit well, it's very wet right here, but once it starts to dry a bit, it's going to start to get into like a tacky kind of consistency. And if some of that paint goes onto your finger, it's still wet, and we want to make sure it's dry to the touch. So just keep on tapping it in places and seeing if it's completely dried. Now, while we wait for our background to dry, I'm going to show you a really easy and fun DIY we can do to prepare ourselves for the dotting of the cherry blossoms we're going to do in a later step, which we're going to do with Q-tips. Now, I've done quite a few of Q-tip paintings, and I find they become frayed the more you use them with the paint, and I end up using multiple Q-tips for a painting, and it's kind of wasteful, and I can't really reuse them after that. Now, I was searching on YouTube and I found a really great, she's a rock painting artist, and she had a great video on creating these DIY paint dotting tools that she used for her rocks for creating these really intricate mandalas with those dots. And I thought that would be great to use also in this cherry blossom tree painting. And that way you're not going to be using too many Q-tips, not going to be creating too much waste, and then you can also reuse these. So if you just wipe off the paint at the end, then if you do other Q-tip paintings in the future, then you can actually keep this in your painting toolkit, and you can use this as a dotting tool in your paintings. Or even if you want to do rock paintings, you can use that for that as well. And also your dots will be more precise rather than, I'm going to show you this one. I completed, I did one tip with the coating that I'm going to show you in a couple of seconds. And this side is the original, where you can see it's kind of fraying already. So it's not going to give us those precise dots. Now, all we have to do is grab a Q-tip, and I'm just going to grab one over here that's not done. So you just grab your Q-tip, and you're just going to take a little bit of paint on your finger. Now, if you're not comfortable doing it with your finger, you can pick up a paper towel, because sometimes you have people have sensitive skin. I do too, so I totally understand. So you can actually do this method just by picking up a paper towel and doing it the same way I'm going to show you. So you just pick up a little bit of paint on your finger, and you're just going to dab it down on the cotton swab part of the Q-tip. And you want to apply not too much, but enough that it becomes fully coated. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your index finger and thumb, and then you're just going to shape it down and get that all the cotton swabs nice and flat against the swab portion, so it's not fraying at all. And that's all you're going to do, and you're going to leave this to dry. Now, once this dries, it's going to become, the paint is going to be kind of like a layer on top of the cotton swab, and it's going to prevent from the cotton from fraying, which is going to give you those really precise dots, and you can keep on using this over and over again without having to replace your Q-tip, and your dots are going to be really super precise. So all you do is you coat the Q-tip with the paint, and then you're going to leave it to dry, and by the time we get to that step, your Q-tip should be fully dried. Now, I've done this for about 3 or 4 Q-tips on only one side. You don't need to do the other side. The other side you can leave as is, or you can do them as well. So I've done them for about 3 Q-tips because we'll be using about 3 to 4 of them at one time to create our cherry blossom tree pattern. Since we're doing a large tree, we use multiple of the Q-tips at once. All right, now once your background is dried to the touch, we're going to move on to painting in our tree shape. Now you can go ahead and if you want to trace in a tree shape of your choice with a pencil right now, but this is an optional step. You do not need to trace it with a pencil. You can just follow along step by step. I'm going to show you exactly how to paint in the tree with a paintbrush without the sketch, so you can feel free to do that as well. So in order to paint in the tree, we're going to need some black on our palette. So if you don't have any black left, or if it's dried out, then you go ahead and add some black onto your palette right now. You don't need very much, about the same amount as we put on in the previous step. So that's good. Now, if you're using the thicker acrylics, then what I like to do, because we're going to be getting into some finer lines here, I like to thin that paint down. If you work with paint that's too thick, it gets really tricky to get those fine lines and those details. So the key to those fine lines and details in our tree branches is going to be using this paint in a thinner consistency. Now, if you're using craft paint, this is often liquid enough and thin enough, so you do not need to thin it down. But if you're using the thicker paint, just go ahead and take your jar of water and bring some water into that paint and thin it down. So you can pick up with your paintbrush, and you basically want it to be the consistency of like a thick liquid, kind of like a gravy, if I could explain it on camera. So once your paint is thinned down to that thick gravy-like consistency, you're going to take your round brush and you're just going to pick up some paint on that brush. And the way I like to load a round brush is by spreading its bristles out in the paint on both sides so that the paint gets loaded inside as well as the outside bristles. And then I like to twirl it around, kind of like a skewer. You're twirling it in the paint so that your tip of your round brush stays really nice and pointed, because that's going to help get really precise lines later on. All right, so now once your brush is loaded with that black paint, we're gonna start off with a tree trunk. And I'm gonna show you here, the tree trunk is not straight. It's really wobbly, and the lines are kind of wavy here. So we're gonna go with that flow. So you're gonna start about an inch to the from the side and an inch above the bottom of the canvas, and you're just going to make a nice wobbly, just going with that flow. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. You're just going to make a nice wobbly line like that, and about 2 inches over, you're going to be doing the same thing. You're going to just go with the flow using the tip of your brush. You don't want to apply too much heavy pressure. You don't want your bristles to spread out. You want just the tip of your brush to touch the canvas, kind of like you're writing with a pen. And you're just going to use that to create these really wobbly, wonderful lines of this tree. Just like that. Now, once your tree trunk outline is painted in, you're going to paint in the center of the tree. So all you're going to do is pick up a little bit more paint, and here you can spread your bristles out a little bit more to get more of a coverage with each paint stroke. So here I'm pressing down my bristles and just going with that flow again. And here, since the tree trunk grows up, we want to go with that wood grain, and we want to use downward and upward strokes to paint in our tree trunk. And at the bottom of a tree trunk, it's just going to be left with these streaks like that. We're not going to fill it in. It's kind of like an abstract version of our cherry blossom tree. All right, now once you've painted in the tree trunk, we're going to paint in our first level of tree branches. So I'm going to make sure I have enough paint on my paintbrush. And with these first level of paint of tree branches, they often point up towards the sun so the leaves can get all the energy from the sun. So we're going to keep that in mind, and we're just going to paint tree branches here. And also these tree branches are going to be thicker towards the trunk, and then they're going to taper out towards the end. So you're going to use more of a pressure with your brush at the beginning, and then you're going to taper off and make a thinner tree branch at the end, like that. And then you can do it here too. Now, if you're not comfortable using heavy downward pressure and then releasing it, because that can be sometimes tricky too, you can just paint in, like we did with our tree trunk, you can just paint in the outline of your tree branch and then paint it in after. So just know where your tree branch is going, and it often points up towards the sky and the sun. And then you're going to paint one side, and then you're going to paint the other. And always the tree trunks are always thicker towards, sorry, the tree branch is always thicker towards the trunk, and then it tapers and gets thinner to away from that trunk. So you're going to paint the other outline of it, trying to use the tip of your brush, of your round brush there, just like that. And then you can paint in the tree branch. Sometimes that's a little bit easier of a technique rather than doing it in one stroke. The earlier version I showed you is that one stroke technique. So we're going to do our next branch. So I'm doing here about 4 main branches, and then after that we're going to move on to the second level and third level branches. And that's basically how tree branches patterns are. They are fractal patterns, so they just kind of repeat but in smaller versions. So here I'm going to do my third main tree branch. So I'm just going to do the version where I'm just going to be tracing the outline of the branch and then filling it in, because that seems to be an easier way of doing it. So you're going to just do, and also with the tree branches, they're not straight, just like our tree trunk, they are wobbly. So just let your hand go where it wants to go, and those when you're not thinking too much and you're just letting your hand move, you often get more natural lines for your tree branches. So I'm going to fill in the other side, and then I'm going to fill in the bottom of the tree branch, just like that. So I'm going to add our 4th main tree branch here, just going with that flow, letting the branches be wobbly and not perfect. In nature, things are not perfect, and it makes it much easier to paint when you realize that you don't have to get things perfectly symmetrical and straight. Okay, so those are the 4 main tree branches on our tree. Now we're going to add our second level tree branches. So basically the second level tree branches are going to be much like the first. They're going to be thicker towards where they attach to the main branch, and then they're going to taper out when they get to the end. So you can add them anywhere. And also to note too that the intersection point between both branches kind of form the letter V. So these branches are going to point up towards the sun, and they're going to be a little bit thicker at the bottom and then thinner as you move up. And then there's going to be almost like the letter V between the intersection point. So this one here, I'm going to add a second level branch like that. And then I'll move on to, actually I'll do another one down here because I did that in my sketch. This one's going to be pointing downwards. Some of the branches point downwards like that. And then on this tree branch, I'm going to do another second level. It's pointing up to the sun, and it's going to be thicker at that intersection point. So I'm going to make it a little bit thicker there. And it's tapered towards the top. And then I'm going to move on to this branch over here. So here I'm going to make another one, second level branch, pointing up. And then I'm going to make it thicker towards the trunk using these nice flowy, wobbly lines. You can definitely follow along with the exact pattern I'm doing, or you can just be free and loose here and just go with that flow, knowing that each branch is basically a copy of the branch before it, and just letting your hand go with the flow and getting those nice wavy branches and keeping them nice and thicker towards the main branch and then tapered towards the end. And also too, we don't have to worry too much about getting these totally on point, because they're going to be, most of them are going to be covered anyways with our cherry blossoms in the later step. A few of them are going to be poking through, but you don't have to worry too much about the detail here about with the branches, since lots of them are going to be covered up. But it's always nice to know how to paint in a tree, because this might help you in further paintings as well. So I'm still working on my second level branches. This one has quite a bit of them. But again, it's up to you how many you make. There, that. And then I'm going to move on to this branch here that I created, and I'm going to create my second level branches here. And one more. Okay. So now that we've done our second level branches, we can move on to third level. So you can go as much detail as you want to. You can go second, third, fourth, fifth level and create really tiny branches. But I'm going to go about three levels down. That's enough detail for me for this tree. So to create those third level branches, you're just going to go from those second ones we created in the last step and create even smaller versions of the same branch. So thicker towards the intersection point, and they form that letter V, and they mainly point up towards the sun. So to keep those three things in mind. And they're wobbly too. They're not straight. They're nice and wobbly. And it helps here not to think too much and just go with that flow. You cannot do it wrong. Now, when you're happy with your tree, we're going to add a tiny bit of detail to the tree trunk to give that wood grain look to the tree trunk. So to do that, we're just going to grab our round brush, and we're going to be using some white. So if you don't have any more white left on your palette, you would add just a drop, not very much at all, just a drop of white onto your palette. And then we're going to pick up a little bit of black and a little bit of that white, and it's going to create a nice gray color. I'm going to pick that up at the tip of our paintbrush, so that's a nice gray color. And then we're just going to create simple thin lines of wood grain. So using just the tip of your paintbrush, like we did with the tree trunk. And you can use fluid strokes, continuous strokes, or you can use choppy strokes, or use both of them. It's often good to get a variation in there. So if your paint is not very flowy, too thick, you can add some water into it to make it flow a little bit better. Sometimes that does the trick with this really thick acrylic paint. So we just want to, again, just create some lines of wood grain in there. We can go up to some of these tree trunks as well, because some of them are going to be seen even when the cherry blossoms are on, because the cherry blossoms will come to about that point there, and some of that branch will show through. So you can add some of that wood grain halfway up of those main tree branches. And some can be thick, some can be thin lines, thick lines, it's all good. Once you're finished adding your details to your tree, we're going to wait for the whole tree to dry before moving on to the next step. So you can pause the video here and give it another couple of minutes, and then just test with your finger to make sure that there are no wet and tacky parts of your tree. All right, now that your tree is completely dry, we can move on to the most fun part, or I like to think of it as the most fun part of this painting, which is creating our beautiful cherry blossoms with our Q-tip method. Now this is a really fun and relaxing method, so you can sit back and relax and enjoy this part. I find I kind of get lost in this Q-tip method part, which is why I find it the most relaxing and fun part of the painting. Now, the first layer of cherry blossoms we're going to do is going to be the darkest red. So what we're going to do is we're going to create four layers of cherry blossoms. We're going to create a dark red, and then a medium red, a lighter red, and finally we're going to add some pure white highlights over top. So the first layer we're going to do with the dark red. So what we're going to do is grab our red. Either you can use your tube paint, or even your bottled craft paint would work fine. And for this red, I'm using alizarin crimson, but you can use any red that you have access to. So you're just going to add a little bit of red onto your palette, just like that. And to create a darker version of that red, you can just simply grab a little bit of black. So if you have black already on your palette, that's great. If not, you can just add just a tiny bit, because we're just going to be adding it to darken that red. Since black is a very intense pigment, very saturated, you need very little of it to darken another color. And you don't want to add too much of that black at first, because it's generally easier to darken a color than to lighten it back up. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to grab any brush. You can grab your round or your, I'll grab my round here because it's a little bit smaller, but any brush will do. So you're going to grab just a little bit of that black on one tip of your brush, and you're going to add it into the red, and you're just going to mix it in until it darkens a bit. You want it significantly darker than the original out of the tube, because we want some contrast, because the second layer we're going to add is going to be that red right out of the tube. So we want this to have a darker contrast with that one. There we go. So that's a nice dark red. I'm happy with that. So you want it to be like almost like a burgundy color. You don't want it to be too dark. You still want to see the red in there and not to be more black. So if you've added a little bit too much and it's too dark for you, then you can go ahead and add a little bit more of that red into the mix to lighten it back up and bring it back more to a burgundy color rather than a dark muddy color. So now what we're going to do is you're just going to try to take off as much of that paint off your paintbrush, so we're not wasting any paint there. Just going to twirl it around, and then you're just going to put that in a jar of clean water. You can even wash it off and put it down if you'd like. There we go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pick up our Q-tips. Now, if you created those DIY non-fraying Q-tip tips, you can grab those now, or if you didn't do it, it's okay. You can just use any simple Q-tips. I'm grabbing 3 here. You can grab 3 or a bundle of 3 or 4. And you're going to take that and you're going to dip it in the paint that we just created, that dark red burgundy paint. And we're just going to start dabbing it. And this is the fun part, where we're just creating those cherry blossom, those really nice, dark, rich cherry blossoms. And you cannot do this wrong. So don't worry about it. Sit back, relax, and just start dotting away. This part is super relaxing, and you just can get lost in the flow of creating these fun Q-tip dots. You can add them onto some branches. It doesn't have to follow a pattern even. You can create some below the branches too. There is no right or wrong way of doing it. And everyone's cherry blossom tree will look different in the end, which is good, because it's nice to have a unique piece of art. That's the beautiful part of art, because every piece is so different. And if you want to put your own flair by adding a couple of cherry blossoms that are coming down to the ground and at the floor, then you can do that as well. Try to cover the top part of the tree with your cherry blossoms. You don't have to cover all of it. Some of the gray backgrounds can still show through, because we're still going to do 3 more layers. So, but we do want this dark layer to show through in the end. So I'm going to show you here. So in the end, you want all 3 colors of, or all 4 colors of paint to show through, and that's what's going to give that depth, the illusion of depth and richness to our cherry blossom tree. So you want to add this dark red all over so that in the end it still shows through. Sometimes people don't want a full tree also. Here I have a full complete tree with none of the background still showing through, but I've also seen students where they're adding cherry blossoms to the branches here and there, and lots of the background still shows through, which is totally up to your style. If you like that look, then you can do that as well. It's always nice to have that creative freedom to put your own flair on paintings. And if you run out of paint, you can always mix some more. So I'm going to just take one single cotton swab, and I'm going to add some of those cherry blossoms falling to the ground. You don't have to do this. This is totally optional, but I like adding a little bit of variation and giving a little bit more interest at the bottom as well. And kind of telling a story. Art always tells some sort of story happening. So in this cherry blossom tree, there could be like a little bit of a breeze and it's hitting this branch here, and some of the blossoms are falling to the floor, to the ground. I'm going to add it on this side too. Just a couple here and there. There we go. Also, when you're done with this color, you want to take your paper towel and just wipe it off. If you've done your Q-tips with the that non-fraying method, you just want to wipe it off the excess so it doesn't ruin the shape that you've created. If you haven't done that DIY Q-tip, then you don't have to wipe it off. You can just leave it as is. All right, now once you're happy with this dark red layer, we're going to wait for it to dry. So you can pause the video here and just wait for this layer of paint to dry. And then we're gonna move on to adding our second layer of cherry blossoms. So now we're gonna move on to creating our second layer of cherry blossoms. And for that, we're just gonna use the red that you used in the earlier step right out of the tube. We're not gonna mix it with anything. So I'm gonna use my alizarin crimson as my red here. We're just gonna squeeze out just a little bit, like that. And then we're going to pick up our Q-tips and we're going to repeat that step, and we're going to layer this red right on top of the darker cherry blossoms we created in the first step. Now we want to make sure that, as I mentioned before, we want all of the layers to show through in the end. So we don't want to completely cover up all of those darker cherry blossoms. We want some of those still to show through, but you can definitely layer on top. So you're going to do this until you're happy with the amount of red that you've added, or red cherry blossoms you've added in this step. And then you're going to wait for your cherry blossoms to dry, and then we're going to move on to the next step. So everyone might do it at different paces, which is totally fine. So it was a nice chance to sit back and grab a sip and chat with each other while you wait for your paintings to dry. And always, as an alternative, if your painting is taking a little bit too long to dry, you can always use a hair dryer to speed up that drying time. An interesting fact about cherry blossoms is that they're the national flower of Japan, and they're also known as sakura there. And in Japan, there is actually a centuries-old custom which is known as hanami, which means flower viewing. And in the early scriptures, it actually hints that it started with the emperors of ancient Japan, which I always thought was fascinating. And one day I do want to go to Japan and see the cherry blossom festival. To me, that custom hanami is kind of like, you know, that saying, stop and smell the roses. Well, this is, in the cherry blossom terms, is stop and watch the cherry blossoms, which I think is beautiful. And I'm just going to take my single Q-tip and add some of those red cherry blossoms falling to the ground like we did at the first step. And again, this is optional. You do not have to do this, only if you want to. Add some on this side too. So basically adding the different layers of red to our tree is going to give our tree a beautiful dimension and depth to the cherry blossoms. That's the key in acrylic painting, is working in layers. When you work in layers, it just adds just this beauty that you can't get with just a single layer of paint. The hardest part I find when doing these paintings is actually waiting for the layer to dry, because when you want to paint, you don't want to wait. You want to just kind of continue into that flow. That's why sometimes using a hairdryer to speed it up will, let you go continue painting much faster. Sometimes I get impatient. I'm like, I just want to paint. So I use the hairdryer trick. Now, if you run out of red and you want to add a little bit more, don't be afraid to add some more onto your palette. So here in my tree, I've purposely left some of it with the background showing through. Some of it might show through in the end. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen right now. I'm just kind of going with that flow. But with yours too, it can evolve as you go. So you don't have to plan too much. You just kind of go with each layer and just see where that layer takes you. All right, now once you're happy with the amount of red that you've added to this layer, go ahead and pause the video. Now we're going to move on to the third layer of our cherry blossom tree, where we're going to be creating some pink cherry blossoms to put on our tree. So for this step, we're going to add a little bit more of that red. So if you don't have any red left on your palette, you can go ahead and add some more. Or if you still have red, then you can just work with that. So as long as we have some of that red on our palette. And we're also going to grab a little bit of titanium white, because we're going to be lightening up this red and it's going to create a really beautiful pink. So just equal amounts of the white to the red, and then you can take any of your brushes and you can start mixing that white into the red. So we want it to be, we want the contrast between this color of pink and the previous red to there to be like a contrast between them. So we want it to be not a pale pastel pink, but quite a bit lighter than we have currently on the tree. Basically, it should be kind of like a rose color. So that is nice. I'm liking that, because the very last layer we're going to do after this is going to be white highlights. So we want it to be, if we have this too light, then there's not going to be any contrast between this pink and that white. So we want there to be, every layer should have a contrast between each other, the colors. So that, I'm happy with that rose color. I'm just going to remove all the excess from my brush as I can by twisting it in the paint. And then I'm going to clean the brush off so that the paint does not dry on my brush, because when acrylic paint dries on your brush, it is really hard and sometimes not possible to remove. And then you can ruin brushes that way too. So it's always nice to clean your brush off in water, leave it in the jar, or better yet, just clean it off right away and put it down on a paper towel to dry. All right, so now we're going to grab our Q-tips and we're going to repeat the same step as before, now with that beautiful pink. So we're not planning too much where we want those flowers to go. We're just kind of going with that flow. And even if that paint below is a little bit tacky and it's mixing a bit, that is totally fine. It's actually going to create some more variation in your colors, which is always a good thing. So you should see the three different colors on your cherry blossom tree now. You should see that dark red, that medium red, and now that pink. So all three colors should show through. And if you prefer at this step, you can always work, if you want to get a little bit more detail, sometimes working with the three, there's a little bit bigger blobs. If you want to actually just go back to one single Q-tip and add them in certain places, you can do that as well. That gives you a little bit more control of where you add your cherry blossoms and where those cherry blossoms go. But you can always use three as well. So it really depends on how you want to do it. And I always like to give different options because everyone is so different in their painting styles. So it's nice to know the different options you have, and then you can pick the one that you like the best. So that should be bringing out your tree now to life with all the three different layers of red and pink. And you can cover some of the branches if you like, or you can have them still showing through. It's up to you. And at the end of this painting, I'm going to show you a way. So for example, if you've hidden too much of one of the colors in your tree, I'm going to show you a way to bring those back. In acrylic painting, you can never go wrong. You can always fix things because all you have to do is wait for the paint to dry and you can relayer. Just going to add a few of the light pink ones falling. And some down here too. Now, once you're happy with the amount that you've added for this layer, you can go ahead, sit back, relax, and wait for everyone to finish. And then we're going to move on to our final layer, which is adding our pure white highlights to our cherry blossom tree. So once this pink layer is fairly dry, it doesn't have to be perfectly dry, it can still be a little bit tacky, we can go and do an optional step here, which is bring back some of those branches in your cherry blossom tree. This is an optional step. If you like the amount of branches that are still showing through, you can skip ahead to the next step. You don't have to do this step. So if you do want to bring back some of those branches and they're getting a little bit hidden with the layers of cherry blossoms you've added, we're just going to add a little bit of black onto our canvas. If you don't on our palette, if you don't already have some, you need very little amount, like a pea-size amount, like that. And then we're going to pick up our round brush, we're going to wet it in water, and we're going to make it really thin like we did when we were painting in our tree. We want it to be nice and fluid, like a thick gravy. And once it's like a thick gravy, you're just going to make sure you twirl the brush in your paint so the brush comes to a nice point. And then you can go through and bring back some of those branches, those black branches, into your tree. Wherever they're hidden too much and you want to bring them back, just go ahead and paint them back in. So I like to add them sometimes at the end, just so you can see that there's branches there holding up those flowers. You just want to use really light pressure on your brush. Again, just using the very end tip, like almost like you're using a pen. That's going to give you those really fine detailed branches. So once you're happy with the amount of branches you've brought back, we want to let that black dry for sure, because when we add our final layer of the white, we don't want that white and that black to mix, because it's going to create a little bit of a gray color in our cherry blossoms. So we're going to wait for that black completely to dry, and then we'll come back to the final step of our painting, which is adding in our final highlights on top of our cherry blossom tree. So you can go ahead and pause the video here and wait for everyone's painting to completely dry. All right, we're at our final step of this cherry blossom tree painting, which is going to be adding in final white highlights on our cherry blossoms. So I've already started here to show you what it looks like compared to what we have on the canvas right now. So it's really going to bring that cherry blossom tree to life. So all we're going to need on our palette is just a little bit of titanium white, or any white you have. So if you have any white right now that's still wet and workable, then you can use that. And if not, you can go ahead and add just a little bit of white. We don't need very much here, just a drop, and then you can always add more as you go. And then you're going to pick up here in this step. I like to work with a single Q-tip because it gives me a little bit more precision on where I want to put those white highlights. Some people like to add just a few all over. Some people like to add a little bit more. So using one Q-tip gives you a little bit more control here with those final white highlights. So pick up your Q-tip and you're just going to dab it in our white paint, and you're just going to add those final white highlights anywhere you want on your tree. So here I'm just going to be adding them all over my tree, and then taking a step back every so often to see if I am happy with where the tree is looking, what the tree is looking like, or if I find like I need to add a little bit more. So just take a couple of seconds every now and then, just take a step back, look at your painting, and seeing where it's at and seeing what needs to be done, or if you're happy with it, you can just stop there. Sometimes I know the hardest part in a painting is knowing when you're done your painting. It's hard to tell sometimes, and And one trick with that is actually just leaving the room for a couple of minutes and just not looking at the painting, and then coming back with fresh eyes. Because sometimes when you're staring at a painting too long, it's hard to know when it's done or not. So just take a couple of minutes, take maybe even a sip of your drink, chat with some friends, and then just turn back around, take a look at your painting, and you should get a better understanding of if you think it's done or not, or needs more layers. I'm just going to go over, as I mentioned before in the video, if you find that you've covered a little bit too much of the colors with the layers on top, I was going to show you a way to kind of bring those back. So the great thing with acrylic paint is that once it is dried, you can layer on top of it endlessly. So you cannot ever do anything wrong with acrylic painting. You can always fix it by just waiting for your paint to dry and then put another layer on top. So for example, here I'm noticing in this tree that I've covered a little bit too much of the red and the pinks below it. And I have a little bit too much white going on there. So don't be afraid to grab your paint colors. And so you just add a little bit of red to your palette. And take your Q-tip. So here I would take a single Q-tip so you have a little bit more control over where those cherry blossoms go. And you're just going to add them in right over top of all your layers, just to bring certain colors back. And if you find you want to add a little bit of the lighter pink, then you just mix it, and then you can add those right there too. So there, it's brought back a little bit more of those red cherry blossoms because I covered them a little bit too much with that white paint. So you can do that anywhere in the tree that is bugging you, and you find that, you know, you want to bring back some of those colors. So don't be afraid to let your paint dry and continuing on with this layering technique until you're happy. And this cherry blossom tree painting is complete. Now take a deep breath and take a look at your unique painting and appreciate the beauty of each paint stroke you just painted. And thank yourself for taking the time today to explore your creativity and being kind to your creation. You did great. Now, as one final step, take a pen or your paintbrush and with a grateful heart, sign your masterpiece. Now, if you want to share your painting with me, there's a few ways. You can tag me on Facebook or Instagram if you're on social, or alternatively, you can actually just email me the pictures directly if you'd prefer that. Either ways, if you do want to share your pictures with me, I'd be so happy to see it. I hope you enjoyed this paint and sip tutorial today, and thank you so much for painting along with me. Stay creative, kind, and nifty, my friends.